Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City or Boston. Good evening if you are in Copenhagen or Cape Town. Greetings to people all around the world. Special love to our loved ones in Ukraine. Stay strong. We are with you. I'm Fred Plotkin. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My guest today is, I'm just going to start by calling him a musician because that certainly covers it, but he is a conductor, composer, arranger, teacher, a man of music in every way. His name is Jonathan McPhee, and Jonathan joins me, I believe, from Boston. Is that correct?
Just outside Boston, yes, Fred.
Just outside of Boston, where it's green and leafy, I see. And you're
And
growing
actually,
in the back.
you just heard a clap of thunder, so I think I'm going to
Really?
get rain coming in here.
Let me ask, what are you growing in the back there over your right shoulder?
Oh, I think that's cucumbers and pumpkins, actually.
Oh, very good. Okay.
Something that happened during the pandemic, you start gardening.
It's true. Jonathan, I'm going to start with your conducting life, and very specifically one thing, because you do conduct symphonic, opera, ballet, dance. You conduct in various genres of music, classical music, and so on. I tend not to make very strong distinctions. However, I made a little list as I was preparing to see you, and here are some of the names. The Boston Ballet, where you were music director of the orchestra for 28 years, New York City Ballet, Australian Ballet, Norwegian Ballet, the Joffrey Dance Company, the Royal Danish Ballet, Houston Ballet, American Ballet Theatre, Martha Graham Dance Company, National Ballet of Canada, Dance Theatre of Harlem, the Royal Ballet in London. So what we're talking about is being a conductor for dance. And number one, the music, not always, but often is different for dance, and it might be for symphonic or for opera, simply because of the way the beat is driven is coordinated for the dance. Now, many works are composed to be danced to as ballets, but there are other works. George Balanchine loved to take music that was not dance music and set it in dance form. What is different about conducting dance than it is for singing or symphonic music?
Yeah, that is a very complicated question, and I'm glad you asked it because it's one of those questions that most people just never get into. Depending on what period of dance music you're talking about, things change. So, for example, if you go back to the days of Petipa and beforehand, before, let's say before 1877, because that's an important year when Tchaikovsky decided to change the history of dance forever. Music at that point, and I just did a production of Don Quixote by Ludwig Minkus. And back then, it was all about the technique of the dancers, what dancers could do. And so the music was supposed to be invisible. It was supposed to simply be a platform that would support the choreography and the dancers. And Minkus had the rare talent of being able to write music that you could play at any tempo, cut it up, invert it, play it backwards. It always seemed to work. So one of the things I always tell orchestras who have not played Minkus is the hard thing about playing this ballet music is you get no clue from the music that's written how it's going to go. And the thing is, it does make sense, but you have to learn the choreography and you have to learn the dancers to be able to find the tempo structure that's different. That would never happen in a symphony. In a symphony, the structure of the entire musical piece is really determined by what the composer wrote. And that is the concentration of the through line as you're going through. So if you think in terms of when you go to the ballet in the mid 1800s or early 1800s, your focus is on the stage.
Mhm.
and the music supports that. When you start getting into the symphonic world, the focus is on the orchestra. When you're in the opera world, it's a combination of two. And in a certain, and of course, these are big generalizations because I could get into a lot more detail, but opera and ballet conducting are closer than symphony, because in symphony, it's basically the conductor who's also making that interpretation, utilizing what the musicians in the orchestra give back to them. But it's still within that structure that
Mhm.
the conductor is shaping. And in opera, you will have a structure as well that is set up by the conductor, but there are things that have leeway depending on the singers. And I always equate the the tenor that holds the note too long, and you've got a choice: you just hang there with them or try and influence them to get off.
Mhm.
Well, you have the same thing in ballet. You'll have somebody who'll suddenly do pirouettes at the end of a phrase, and the music goes bump bump, but you'll go bump
Mhm.
bump and try and influence them to change. So there's technically that kind of similarity. When you move past Tchaikovsky, and I'm hoping we're going to get into Tchaikovsky versus Wagner at some point, because there's some interesting thoughts that I have on that one. But when you get to somebody like George Balanchine, who is a musician, and a lot of these really truly great choreographers were musicians, so they could look at a piece of music and the structure of the music came to them first, and they came up with a musical interpretation itself that's valid. And then they created choreography that works with it. And yes, there are little differences that they allow, just like no three recordings of Beethoven's Fifth are the same. But that kind of musical intelligence coming from the creator of the ballet changes how the conductor then approaches it.
But sometimes it's just the sheer performative issues that sometimes a problem arises because the singers and the dancers are living, breathing, moving figures.
Yeah.
And or sometimes it's a piece of stage scenery that gets in the way, or the light, or something technical unrelated to the human being doing the performing that requires the conductor to quickly adapt or accommodate.
Yes.
I mean, a famous example, I worked at the Met for many years, people know, and I remember once a very famous soprano was singing an aria from Mozart that she had sung at least 1,000 times, but suddenly went up on the lines and skipped a verse.
Yeah.
And James Levine, the conductor, just simply caught his orchestra up and adapted it. And I knew, and a few people caught what she had done, but then she quickly recouped as well. Now, it was not that she was afraid or whatever, it's just mistakes happen, even to the greatest singers, and she was one of them. But therefore, you as a conductor in the pit, either for ballet or for opera, have to constantly not only be leading a musical interpretation, but also be listening and watching to see where that happens.
Yeah. Now, that's an interesting example that you bring up, because there's an advantage in the opera world when a singer does that to the ballet world, which is different. And if you're playing in an opera orchestra, opera musicians always have one ear on what's going on with the singer, and they're seeing the conductor, and it's sort of a three-way that way. So in an instance like that, the conductor can frequently, if they know that the singer's not going to correct it, you do that to the stage and everybody shifts. Ballet dancer, the orchestra never sees what's going on stage, so they have no clue. When there's a problem on stage with a dancer and you actually intuitively picked up on what is common between ballet, opera singing, and music, and it's something that actually Martha Graham, as I was starting out, caught me on. She said, what's the thing all musicians and dancers do in common? And you don't want to get it wrong in front of the great lady, right? So
No.
sweat, sweat, sweat. And it was the breath. And she said, breathing as a musician or a dancer tells you everything about the speed or the quality of what happens next. And it's true. So if you see a violinist and they go, dum, da, 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 dum, you could tell from that preparation what you're heading into. Or if they go, la, dum, dee, dum, dee, same thing. So that is the one common jumping off point. So when you have as a conductor a situation where a dancer says, oh, no, that's too fast. That's not what they mean normally. What it means is this section I just stopped in, I can't dance at that speed. But almost always what caused that problem happened beforehand. So it's a transition, and I find the transitions are always the keys. So backing up through the choreography, you'll see that maybe there's a diagonal upstage, which takes a little more time. And musically, you can, just as there are different interpretations by different people conducting the same piece, you can look at that and say, well, I can make a valid rallentando that gives them a little more time up there. And then I can play the same tempo on the diagonal and it's going to work. So, you know, part of this is understanding the other language, which is physics, in there. But I mean, you just nailed one of my sensitive points where, you know, the thing that I always have hated in this career is when somebody makes the snide comic comment, well, there's only two tempos in dance, too fast and too slow. Yeah. And it's a cheap shot, and it doesn't explain the problem.
Well, you know, another thing that came out to me in your reply was you and I both began so young in the business, because I'm not going to say we're old, that we knew Martha Graham.
I know it. I know. I owe so much to her.
What else do you owe to Martha Graham?
Oh, well, I guess I should back up and tell the story. I'm hoping that people out there know Martha Graham is the mother of modern dance, and two instances that will resonate with everybody. Copeland's Appalachian Spring came about because Martha commissioned it and she choreographed it. The other thing is Martha Graham was the first modern dancer ever to dance with a classical ballet company, and it was the Ballet Russe, and it was Massine's choreography and Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, with Leopold Stokowski conducting it and the Philadelphia Orchestra. So she was a groundbreaker that attracted great artists like Andy Warhol, actors, Tony Randall, Gregory Peck, all studied with her because she knew how.
First Lady Betty Ford.
Betty Ford, that's right. That's right. And she used to hang around backstage, as all these people did, because they all owed to her the fact that when they studied with her, she knew how to control space. So I remember asking one day, it was Tony Randall, why are all these actors around Martha Graham? And he said, well, don't you know? I mean, if you want to be a great actor on stage, you have to know how to control space. So the distance between you and a set piece, or you and the other actor, is as strong a message as anything that comes out of your mouth. And I thought, God, I'd never even thought of that before. But it's true. So Martha, for me, you know, I had gone to the Royal Academy first, and then I went to Juilliard, and I was thinking symphonic career. I loved ballet. When I was in London as a student, I used to go to the ballet and I used to go to the opera.
Can I ask what years you were in London?
Oh, God. All right. Now you're going to really get into the old part. So
no, because I think we may have overlapped. That's why I'm asking. Okay.
Well, I moved there when I was still in high school.
Okay.
So I moved there in 1969.
Okay.
And I graduated early, and I went to the Royal Academy in 1971.
Okay.
To 74.
In 73.
We were there.
Yeah. Okay. And I was going to Royal Ballet performances, the opera too, but I was living in Italy, and therefore I was coming to Italy to London to see things I was not seeing in Italy. I was studying and working in opera in Italy, so I went to a lot more ballet in London than I did in Italy. And I went to spoken theater, and I saw Olivier and Ritten and Gielgud and that whole gang, and Judi Dench and Vanessa Redgrave and Maggie Smith and all those people doing everything Diana Rigg that they did every season.
Oh, yeah.
And I would come to London 3 or 4 times for 10 days usually. And frankly, my development and knowledge of ballet came not in my native New York, but in London. And I was more trained on the repertory in London than I ever have been in New York. I acquired it after New York when I worked at the Metropolitan Opera House and was responsible when ABT and other visiting American Ballet Theater and other visiting companies came in. That's where I got to know Martha Graham. But
So that was me conducting, by the way, at the Met.
that was you conducting Martha?
Yes.
Okay.
1980. So that
Yeah.
whole big, do you remember the season
1980.
with Rudolf Nureyev and
Exceedingly well.
yeah, okay. And we did a 6-week season there, and that was the one that changed my life. And I was one of the 2 conductors who was there.
I first set foot in the Met in a work context in late 79, but my job growth happened more in 80 and 81. So
We
that
were there. And we were in London at the same time, which is funny.
Yeah, I did not know each other. But I guess what I want to get back to about London and the Royal Ballet is when I grew up liking ballet. There was a girl I liked in high school who wanted to be a ballerina, so I went to more ballet with her than ever I would have on my own as an opera guy. But I got to see many of the great dancers of ABT and visiting companies here in New York. But somehow there was something about going to the Royal Ballet at Covent Garden and the knowledge that the audience had and the great heritage of the dancers and the ballet masters and so on. And the reason for that, I came to be told by people, was that there were certain cities in Europe, primarily Paris, Copenhagen, St. Petersburg, and London, that had a huge ballet heritage. And while other cities such as Milan and Vienna, great opera cities, had ballet companies, they didn't have the ballet traditions. And people would even say to me that London was an afterthought and that the big 3 were Copenhagen, St. Petersburg, and Paris.
No, it's true.
I don't quibble about those, but I believe that to be true. But nonetheless, London had so much, because all the great dancers, those other 3 cities would come to London and perform, that the knowledge of that audience, the audience I found in New York knew ballet, admired it, but admired the athleticism. So, for example, Cynthia Gregory, a ballerina that I really came to love for her performances, was so technically proficient playing the Black Swan in Swan Lake that you lost track of the fact that she was an artist because she was doing these remarkable physical feats. Whereas in London, where I would see Nureyev, the young Nureyev, Margot Fontaine, who I got to know a bit, Merle Park, Anthony Dowell, all those people were people who made a huge impression on me in terms of what ballet could be. Now, remember, I'm an opera guy. And to me, the ultimate problem with dance is that no one talks or sings or anything. And to me, I'm a product of the voice and that communication. But nonetheless, especially in London more than anywhere else, I really came to respect and admire what dance could be.
No,
and so please talk about your formation in that environment, because it is a very special environment for people who conduct dance.
It is, and actually, I like you, my dance background and knowledge really came from those London years, and there were 3 conductors at the Royal Academy, myself, Bram Tovey, who just passed away, and Simon Rattle, and one of the nice, yeah, it was a good class. One of the nice, I was the Yank, so yeah, but one of the nice things about studying there as a conducting student is that you were encouraged, Morris Miles was our main professor, and you were encouraged to have a relationship with one of the conductors of the Big 5 that were there in London. So I got a letter of recommendation.
Big 5 orchestras.
Big 5 orchestras, yeah. So Simon went to Sir Adrian Boult. I actually went to Rudolf Kempe, who was at the Royal Philharmonic, and my teacher played in the Philharmonic, so it was an easy match. But the other thing is we used to get free tickets So I didn't pay for anything. If I did, it was like 50 pence. And consequently, for me, I always felt so far behind the English kids who had like ear training as a 5-year-old. And, I was in the American school system, and in particular, the Eustacia school system, the military. My father was in the Air Force. So I felt like I was always trying to catch up with what was going on in there. And I went to the ballet a lot and the opera. And like a lot of people, I think, maybe not you, but the opera takes work to learn the libretto and what's going on with the language and the whole bit. And it was much easier for me to go to the ballet because I could just sit there and enjoy it. And my favorite couple was Antony Dell and Antoinette Sibley.
Yes, sure.
And little would I know that, like, many years later, when Antony Dell was the artistic director for the Royal, I'd premiered his new Swan Lake at the Royal. And then I actually did Antoinette Sibley's farewell performance in The Dream, Frederick Ashen's The Dream, which was an amazing thing. So being in that environment where you get to see that kind of world-class dancing. And I learned when I went to New York, and of course then picked up all of the modern dance, worked closely with Martha and Agnes DeMille. You start to see differences in style. Now, this is beginning to change somewhat, but 30 years ago, 35 years ago, you could hear an oboist in an orchestra and you could tell what city the orchestra was from. Whether it was a French orchestra, a German orchestra, an American orchestra. And what I began to sense was the training of dancers musically made a difference that I could actually feel, and I would have to be careful of, because if I went into the other environment, I could actually screw things up. So the English, who were basically Russian trained, transplanted, one of the two Russian brothers went to London and started that whole school. They tended to dance on the back half of the beat. So if I was a little too fast, they still stayed on the back half of the beat. So you have to realize that you're not going to, push that. Once I got to New York City Ballet, and Martha Graham and Mr. Balanchine happened almost at the same time in my life. But Martha is the reason that I met Mr. Balanchine. They dance on the front half of the beat. So there's a very subtle thing that you can actually make a dancer very uncomfortable by just an imperceptible change of how they are dancing, and I can move that. So the London style, which is where I came first, and then learning the New York style at New York City Ballet, and then being able to go back and forth between the two, and then going up to National Ballet Canada, which I did there, and that depended on the choreographer because the dancers were already able to go in both directions. I don't know, it's a subtle thing, but for me, it was really fascinating.
Well, let's get very musicological just for a couple of moments. Why does a beat have two halves?
Because what goes up must come down.
I see. Because you're saying dance on the first half of the beat or the second half of the beat.
Yeah.
The front or the back, let's call it.
Okay, so here's an illustration. So if you are at the old New York City Ballet with Mr. Balanchine, when I give a beat and you have the ictus that hits, the dancer is already there.
Okay.
At the Royal, part of the elegance was I would hit the beat and they move into it.
Mm-hmm.
Very subtle difference, but it's a real difference. It's one I had to figure out.
So I was performance manager at the Met in the 80s. And at that time, we had what was called presentation season. The opera company, our home company, was there from late September into May, typically. And then usually we would have opera ball on a Saturday night after a Bohème or a Traviata. And while opera ball was happening, everything relating to the opera in terms of scenery, costumes, and such was loaded out into the warehouse. And they would have the load in of American Ballet Theater, ABT, for
Yeah.
7, 8, or 9 weeks. We'd have rehearsals on Sunday and open on Monday with ABT. And it was an entirely other audience, and everything was different. ABT was the first thing in presentation season, but after that, we had, for that time, a wonderful, magnificent person who I love, whose name was Jane Herman.
Oh,
And
I know Jane.
yeah,
Yeah.
Jane Impresaria Assoluta, as she was known,
The voice.
incredibly funny, incredibly talented, incredibly foul-mouthed on occasion, but I loved
Yep.
her. And just a wonderful mentor for someone who was a young person wanting to be in arts management. And Jane was the one who could envision things happening in presentation season that everyone said nobody could do that, and she would pull it off. So my first year, we had Yves Montand sell out for a week, and I was co-manager. I was the junior manager then, and the senior person swooned at the idea of having Yves Montand there. So I said to her, "You can have Yves Montand, and I get his wife, Simone Signoret." And that was a very good deal because I loved Simone Signoret. Yves Montand, fine. But everyone said, how can Yves Montand play the Met for a week? It was the hottest ticket in town. And everyone would come to the Metropolitan Opera House in presentation season. Not that everything sold out. Jane brought in the Finnish National Opera that had never been seen outside of Finland. Fantastic. The English National Opera. She would bring in opera companies, but primarily she brought in dance companies. And there would be a mix of the Royal, of the Kirov, as it was then known, the Mariinsky from St. Petersburg, the Bolshoi from Moscow, more
Australian ballet she brought in.
Australian ballet, folk dance troops, local American groups such as Dance Theater of Harlem, Arthur Mitchell. He and I became very close friends. Twyla Tharp. Everybody was there except for the New York City Ballet, which was next door, what was then called the New York State Theater. But some of the dancers, especially Mikhail Baryshnikov, would go back and forth between the two theaters, dancing with different companies. I came to know Natalia Makarova, all of these great figures of dance they made opera singers seem easy by comparison in terms of the demands. And I'm not complaining, but it was just harder to work with dancers because they were focused very much on their bodies, on their moods, on their moments, and they were not as communicative as opera singers. And even the most difficult opera singer, we know who we're talking about, was easier than many ballet dancers. And most of the opera singers, even the ones with big personalities like Birgit Nielsen and so on, Grace Bumbry, who I adored, were so much easier because they had to be collaborative with everyone else. The dancers each would have their own mood, and they'd move into a dressing room for the entire run and set up housing practically in the dressing rooms, whereas with opera we'd have people in and out of the dressing room every night. Their rivalries and so on that would happen off stage, their love affairs and whatever, would get played out onto the stage. But on the other hand, you would see such feats of artistry, and great as they all were, I must single out Rudolf Nureyev, who was just on a different level than anyone else I'd ever experienced in dance. He was like Pavarotti or Sutherland or Nielsen, that he just brought something completely extra, singular, and unique to him. He wasn't always easy, but he was absolutely irrepressibly lovable, and you want to do whatever you could to help him. Because what he would create on the stage was just mind-boggling. And it was not just athleticism, because Baryshnikov and many of the others had that, but it was a poetry, it was a beauty. And seeing him dance with Margot Fonteyn was very special because it was like Pavarotti and Sutherland performing together. And so I came to develop a very different appreciation and feeling for dancers than I ever had for singers because of the way they behaved off stage and the requirements of me in the context. But it was a very special time because Jane Herman brought in all the big stars of dance, but also had the courage to bring in the ones that the audience would have to learn about. She didn't just bring in the big, the Danes and the Australians she would bring in La Scala. And I remember I had worked at La Scala before coming back home to New York, so that I knew the La Scala dancers. And the La Scala Ballet had never performed in New York, and except when they came in 1976 and they would dance during Don Carlo, but they never came as La Scala Ballet. And it opened up worlds. And I remember especially the Russian companies would have to take great care about where they wandered away from the theater, because at that time it was still the Soviet Union and they felt very observed. But I found the Russian dancers have this remarkable soul and character, perhaps bigger than any other dancers I found, because there was something in their tradition, whether they were from Moscow or Kiev, which was then Soviet Union, or St. Petersburg, wherever, or Leningrad, wherever they were from. There was just an extra dimension, and Nureyev had that, but he brought it to the West. Baryshnikov had it, but Baryshnikov was more of an internationalist, I think, in my experience, and was able to more readily adapt to different kinds of choreographers, and had a feeling for Fred Astaire and American dance idioms, and could be all of that, like a Placido Domingo, who was much more of an internationalist, whereas Pavarotti had a smaller range of things that he did, but everything he did was just fantastic within the Italian context. And so for me, it was a huge, huge learning curve. And I guess this whole discussion leads to the fact that I'm wondering, Jonathan, whether ballet has changed in terms of the nature of the artist, not the technical proficiency, but the artistic temperament.
Well, like so many things in music, the technical proficiency has continued to rise to a higher standard. So there are things I'm seeing, 15 and 16-year-olds doing in dance that are amazing. I mean, they're just technically so proficient. I think the biggest change that I'm seeing is some of the opposite of technical things, the artistry, the historical knowledge, that when you're in an environment like some of the places you mentioned, La Scala Ballet Company and the Paris Opera Ballet. I mean, there's something about the tradition where it's a family and they're together a lot all the time. Well, all the time, and things are not out of repertory. And so you've got one generation that's teaching the other generation not just the steps, but the historical or reasons for doing something. I worry a little bit that that's getting lost. Perfect example. I've been around long enough so that I've seen. I was in the rehearsal when Mr. Balanchine was creating something, or Agnes was restaging one of her ballets, like Fall River, Legend, with a DTH or Rodeo. I can remember one instance watching a company I was.
Dance Theater of Harlem.
Yeah, Fall River was Dance Theater of Harlem. That's
you
right.
And I can speak in shorthand, but I have to have my viewers know what we're talking about.
Oh, sorry.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So you take something. Here's a simple example. I watched a company doing Rodeo, and I just wandered into the rehearsal, and I saw the stager, and Agnes DeMille, who created it, was of course dead at that point. So I watched the stager, and they said, cowboys do this. That was correct. I can remember being in the studio with Agnes when she said, and it was Joffrey Ballet in the early 80s. Okay, so the cowboys do this and they do that. And then she said, no, that's not right. You have to remember, that's the horizon. And the cowboys are going, and there's where I'm going, over the horizon. And the whole movement changes. It's still the same physical movement, but suddenly knowing that it's the horizon and you're going to the horizon changes the way it comes across to the audience. And I can think of so many ballets that I have worked in and lived in, where that difference between a technical step and the reason for doing the step. And sometimes I worry that the reason for doing the step gets lost now. And, you know, especially dance in particular, it's less of it is written down. Yes, we have videotapes now, which help, but videotapes have mistakes, and then those mistakes become permanently part of the ballet, which I've seen that happen too.
That's like when you have a score. My dad was a music editor, and I remember he was working on a Mahler score, and he said, no, this should be a C natural, not a C sharp. And it had been a C sharp for a long time because the mistakes kept being repeated.
Yeah.
But he knew, because he was a fantastic musician, it would be a C natural. And he had to fight to get that corrected. And had to go back into the New York Philharmonic archives to discover that, in fact, Mahler's original hand had it as a C, but the printers had made it a C sharp.
Yeah, no, that's actually, now that you've got MOLA, which is the Major Orchestra Librarian Association, it's actually tracking all of those printing errors and different editions and everything. It's gotten a lot easier. But in my day, when we were studying, you know, at the Academy in Juilliard, one of the most valuable things were those sessions where we would sit with the conductor, you know, Kempe, who would say, yes, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. I mean, I still treasure my Firebird 1919 suite score, which has the all-time world record for the number of mistakes in it. And it's just got all of the corrections in red. And it's just like more red than print. But yeah, that was a tradition that was, if you were lucky enough. Oh, Manuel Rosenthal. Do you remember when he came to the Met?
Conducted what we called it Parade. It was a program of 3 one-act operas in French from the beginning of the 20th century. Or actually 2 operas and a ballet.
Yes, I was there with him because Joffrey was going to do the definitive revival of Parade, and the original costumes, Mr. Joffrey owned those, and they were up at MoMA for this whole big thing. But there's all those, you know, there's all those questions in the score like flaxenor. What instrument is a flaxenor? And Mr. Joffrey said, Manuel Rosenthal's over at the Met doing this now. Why don't you go and have some sessions with him? And I did. And it was brilliant. And he told me the whole history of the flaxenor, and because he was a protege of Satie's.
So what is a flaxenor?
Okay, well, literally it means splashing sound, but it doesn't give you a lot of help to reproduce it. Yep. So he said, oh, yeah, I remember when we were doing this in the studio. You know, first of all, we tried a big barrel of water on the orchestra, and we hit it with an oar, and it would go, but the problem was everybody got wet, so that wasn't going to work. So then we tried a carton, like a milk carton, and put plate glass in it, and then dropped that, and it sounded great once. And then you drop it for the next one, and as the glass compressed, the sound went away.
Yeah.
So he said, we did finally find a solution. I said, what was the solution? And he said, the solution is you get 2 cymbals of different sizes. You invert one on a table, take the handle off, and then you take the bigger one and you drop it on it, and it goes whoosh, and then like that. So I went down to Carol's Music Store in New York and went through their whole collection of brass cymbals until I found 2 that made the flaxenor sound. And that's what we did at City Center when we did the performances. But he was great.
Well, I want to point out for listeners that I believe he still holds the record for having been the oldest conductor to ever appear at the Met. And I believe in his last appearance, he was 98 years old.
Oh, gee.
Not his debut. I worked his debut. And he was already 90 or 88, something like that. But he came back a couple of times. And I think his last appearance, he was 98 years old.
Well, he seemed timeless to me. And then I got to know him well enough that he finally opened up about World War II. Do you know he was a member of the French Resistance?
Yep.
I mean, it was,
Well,
we forget. I mean, that's where I felt very young at the time, because World War II seemed so far away. And then you talk to somebody like that who
well,
talks
it
about
may
some
or
of the
may not
reasons.
have. I don't know your experience, but I grew up surrounded by people with ink on their arms who had very direct memories of World War II because they were in camps, and people
Yeah.
who lived on West 72nd Street in New York who were of Viennese origin, who either loathed what happened in Vienna or quietly supported what had happened. And in my experience growing up in New York City, I was surrounded by people for whom the war was very much a constant thing. But a point I want to make, and I was going to make it initially about dance, but now as a larger point, is one of the reasons I do this program, one of the reasons I do a lot of the kind of work I do in talking to people like you, is that I am very concerned that there'll be an informational blackout. And we saw it in dance. We saw it in dance when AIDS ravaged mostly the male dancers, and including Rudolf Nureyev, so that the people who would be the ones to pass along the knowledge and the experience of how a man would dance a particular role suddenly vanished. And yes, in dance, there is notation or documentation that can show in a book or perhaps on film what a dance looks like. But as you correctly said, it can also build in the errors that happened and don't have the philosophy behind a gesture the way you pointed out with Agnes de Mille, which is why I try to document so much of everything that I can. But another thing is audiences need to know this, because otherwise an art form becomes a commodity. It's no longer an artistic expression. And if we expect a dancer or a singer to know, or a pianist to know what came before them in terms of how the art form was built, not that they're supposed to repeat the past, but they're supposed to know the past and then make their own contribution to moving the art form forward. I'm very concerned about this, and I think that the health of all the arts, not just in America, but everywhere, will change the more that we digitize, that we commodify, that we stream, although streaming has its benefits. But if we take audiences away from the live communal experience of the arts and make it something that we have on our computer screen or can download or whatever, our conversation is one thing, but a performance is something quite different.
Yeah.
And I believe that, I'm only speaking to you for the first time, really, but I've come to understand that we've lived enough parallel lives and we're set foot in the same places simultaneously, that what we have seen and learned and are able to explain is crucial. And if that goes, a lot goes with it. It's kind of like dead languages that if we lose a tribe in the Amazon and they're the last speakers of a language, with them goes a culture when they are not around. It's not as dire in the arts, but definitely something gets lost. And to me, the biggest example, because I saw it personally, was when AIDS cut through the, yes, opera certainly, but absolutely the dance world, more than opera.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head for one of the big traumas that I've seen, which is, my home company in the 80s, which was Joffrey, was the hardest hit, I think, of all the companies as far as the AIDS epidemic. And we lost a lot of friends, but in fact, Mr. Joffrey also.
Mhm.
So you are correct. There's a group that we're missing, and part of the challenge today with the artistic directors that are taking over is that there was a natural progression of people who would become dancers, and then they would transition, but they would learn about lighting, and they would learn about production values, and they would learn about the music, and then they would earn their way into the next step. And what happened was, when that whole middle area got wiped out, you had people that transition from, oh, I stopped yesterday, now I'm an artistic director. And the pressure on them. and they were missing part of the toolkit. Some of them have done really, really well at trying to fill in the blanks quickly. But there were a lot of instances where people got pushed up too soon. And it's been, and it affected, the AIDS thing affected the audiences too, because for a while there, I remember walking into like, well, some of the bookstores that were in New York, and you'd look at the ballet section and there'd be 3 rows of ballet books and maybe 1 row of opera. And then as the AIDS epidemic went through a decade, you ended up with 1 row of ballet and maybe 2 rows of opera, because that sort of came up through that whole thing, because there was a stigma that got attached to the ballet world when it should never have happened that way anyway. And so I think a lot of audiences decided that they weren't going to support ballet because there was something wrong with it. And that's why we had all this problem. And that, I think, has dissipated. It's been tough on the art form. The financial pressures that we all face trying to make budgets go. And this is, I'm just being in South Africa, I was listening to the things that they are challenges financially, but it means if you have less and less time with the people who really have that history that they're passing on in the rehearsal phase, oh no, instead of 6 weeks of rehearsal, you've got 5 days.
Mm-hmm.
What can you do in 5 days? You can get the basic steps out, but that sort of thought process behind the steps, you don't have time for it, and it's difficult. I'm very concerned about that too. We do have some people. You mentioned it, watching Sir John Gielgud in London. Well, his niece is Maina Gielgud,
Mm-hmm.
who's the great lady of dance. I was just working with her again in South Africa, and we've known each other for 40 years. She knows about the theater because that's, she's theater royalty. Yep. She knows about dance. She's curious enough to always ask about music and make sure that she's got good people around her that she can trust. And when you watch her go into a studio, the dancers just light up, because it's not just, turn your head left, turn your head right. Mm-hmm. It's, you're looking to him and he's over there and you're saying something to him like, why can't I get to you? That dialogue. I used to watch Mr. Balanchine in the rehearsal studio. He had ballets that were not stories, mm-hmm. but when he would teach them, he would tell a story. There was a constant through line of, I said to her, oh yes, and then you said to me this and this. And it gives context to the dancers that is not written down anywhere.
Yeah, it's concerning. I want to get to one other musical element before going to a different issue in ballet music. I can tell you, and I'll name the score. It's Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet. It is a masterpiece. It's a fantastic piece of music. But because ABT and other companies did it so often, and I heard it at the Met so often, I came to hate the music for a long time. Because I said for a time, because it got so repetitive for me. And I could hear what, when I'd be in my office and I'd have the sound on, I could hear what was happening. I knew, the Capulets were lamenting or whatever, but I just couldn't stand it at a certain point. Even though I recognized how brilliant it was, I somehow appreciated his Cinderella a lot more. I felt that remained fresh for me, but Romeo and Juliet I couldn't stand because of overexposure. So I put it aside for a long time, and recently I went to hear Marin Alsop conductor with the New York Philharmonic, and it was fabulous because I heard it as music and not connected to the movement. Now, some of the classical ballets, the Tchaikovskys and Delibes and certain others, Minkas, you can tell me who in Prokofiev, composed to movement. or the movement got baked into where certain things happened in the music. Puccini did that in Tosca, where everything was very choreographed. But in general, in opera, there was more room for interpretation, and someone's Mimi was different from someone else's Mimi, and someone's Rigoletto was different from another, and so forth, even though the notes were the same. How is freshness kept in that kind of music when it is so geared to movement in a way that opera or symphonic is just not?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we frequently change casts, and each cast brings something different to the music and to their performance. So even though, you have X, Y, and Z movements that have to happen in this one musical phrase, where that X, Y movement actually fits on the phrase, it could be syncopated, it could be on the beat. That keeps it fresh, in that you're never quite, there is an element of unpredictability. It never locks in, and should never lock in to being exactly the same night after night. Nutcracker is the biggest challenge for that one. Romeo and Juliet, depending on the choreographer, different musical cuts, different musical orders. I have my own favorite versions as opposed to some other versions, but you picked one of my all-time favorite ballet scores. I mean, to live inside it is an experience that you just can't get enough of in a lifetime. So I never get tired of the music. Cinderella is kind of interesting that you brought that up, though, because Cinderella of the two is the least appreciated and understood score, where Romeo and Juliet is a real telling of the Shakespeare. And the music is so perfect, you almost forget about the music because you get Shakespeare's emotion. Cinderella, Prokofiev pushed new boundaries in orchestration. So he did things orchestrationally that nobody had ever heard before. And it's one of the most complex orchestrations ever that every composer should study. Because if you want to learn how to do it, you look at Cinderella.
Maybe
amazing.
That's why I like it. I'm not saying I'm special, but I think there was just more for me to grab onto in terms of as a listener and as someone trained to music, but as a listener who, you much, much better than I could explain what those innovations are. But nonetheless, I knew something was going on, as Aretha Franklin used to say about quality and genius.
Yeah.
Aretha would say, he's got something going on.
Yeah. And the thing is, every time you listen to Cinderella, you'll hear something different that you didn't hear the first time. And that is the complexity of the orchestration. And there isn't that same complexity in Romeo and Juliet.
I know.
But it's great stuff.
It is. And I recognize his genius, but now you've explained to me why I happen to much prefer his score for Cinderella. Now, I want to get to something, another aspect of your career as a musician. Ballet arrangements. What is a ballet arrangement? You've done many: Nutcracker, Rodeo, Firebird, Ramonda, Don Quixote, Paquita, The Princess and the Pea, to name a few. What is a ballet arrangement?
Okay, well, a lot of times it has to do with, we need to get this on and we've got a problem. So, for example, one of the Martha Graham, when she finally did her Rite of Spring, and people had waited 40 years for her to do a Rite of Spring. It was 1984, and she took me aside and said, I'm finally ready to do Rite of Spring if you can spend 6 weeks with me in the studio. And I was under contract with Joffrey Ballet, and Mr. Joffrey adored her for obvious reasons. And he said, yep, I'm going to let you go to her. And we started working on the ballet. She wanted me just there as, you know, sort of the musical framework to say, not that she needed it, because she was brilliant, but she just wanted somebody there that she trusted to say, you know, that's not good taste musically.
Mhm.
And then as we started looking at the season, and I remember discussions, Halston was very, very active on the board, and
Fashion designer.
yeah, fashion designer, and instrumental in making a lot of things happen for her, and somebody I worked closely with when it came to budgeting the musics, because from the beginning, I don't know how it was, from day one with the Graham Company, I remember getting called in and saying, can you put together the music budget for our Met season? And it was like, yeah, it's not rocket science. I can figure that out. Here are the union rates, and we go through all that stuff. So I ended up always doing that. Well, I looked at New York State Theater, which is what it was called back then, and I looked at the old pit, and there was no way we were going to get the full Rite of Spring Orchestra in there. So immediately I had a problem. Now, are you going to deprive the public of Martha's creation, or are you going to figure out how to get it in the pit? So Rite of Spring was one of those that, as a student conductor, I had, you know, I'd known intimately, and I just started looking through the score and saying, okay, I know Stravinsky's progression from 1910 Firebird, 1919 Firebird, 1945 Firebird, the two versions of Petrushka. He was learning orchestration as he went, because again, his musical roots and musical muscle was really created on the Ballet Russe, and having the ability to write something and hear it right away. So Rite of Spring, which is near the end of that period, and we forget that I'm digressing, never mind. The Rite of Spring, he's at the top of that period as far as his creativity, but he also had massive forces to work with. So the question is, can you look at that and say, I can get the same sounds making fewer people work harder? And then you have to look orchestrationally at how to hide things. So you can fool the ear into thinking they're hearing 8 horns if you happen to have 2 trombones who are not doing anything, and you can stick them in the middle of the horn section. So you're hearing horns on top and the same horn color on the bottom, and the middle notes are filled in. So while she was working on that during the day, at night, I was going through the orchestration and figuring out how I could arrange it and how small I could get the orchestra without losing the integrity of the piece. And I got it down to a minimum of 64. We fit in the pit. Premiere went. Leonard Bernstein was 3rd row center behind me. And you know, I was told that as I was walking into the pit, and it was like, oh no. And afterwards, I got a note from Martha saying, please come up to my dressing room. And he was up there with his daughter, Jamie. And
Who has appeared on this program.
Oh, great. Okay.
Jamie has, yeah.
And it started a whole friendship with him that was also very, very important to me. But that's sort of the necessity answer to why are you doing arrangements for ballet? And there's when you look at that list of ballets that I have arranged, there's a story that goes with every single one of them. That you know, some instances like Don Quixote, at the time I did that, there was only 1 copy. Well, you couldn't get any copies from Russia, Soviet Union, into the United States. And when Nureyev defected and went to the Royal Ballet, Jack Lanchbury was the music director, who also was ABT after that. And Jack got a copy of the Minkus score. And then, since he's, you know, the English equivalent of a Broadway composer as well, he decided, I'm going to make this really, you know, juicy and modernize it. And he did a wonderful arrangement, which can only be done with Nureyev's choreography. They were linked. And then suddenly Boston Ballet in 1989 announced that we were going to do it. Nuria fired his lawyer. We got caught in the whole thing. And our artistic director, Bruce Marks, said, we're going to do a brand new Don Quixote. And I almost choked in the press conference. It's like, where are you going to get the music? So that was another one of those where I had a piano score and I had to start orchestrating the darn thing. And, you know, I've tweaked it over the years. And then Maina just did her new Don Quixote in South Africa, and it was different enough that no version will fit. And same thing, I did a new arrangement of that one, and we just recorded it with Cape Town Philharmonic, which is, I was very happy with it.
Did you have anything to do with the Firebird that was done at Dance Theater of Harlem in the 1980s?
John Torres's, yes.
Okay, so I have to tell you, I think in my experience from the 80s, that was my most exhilarating dance experience. Love Nureyev, love Margot Fontaine, Cynthia Gregory, all those people, Makarova, I love them all. But to me, the most exciting, I'm getting goosebumps as I speak about it, dance experience that I had as someone working in these theaters was that one. Would you, anything you have to say about Arthur Mitchell, who I became a friend of, everything about Dance Theater of Harlem and their presentation of Stravinsky's Firebird?
Yeah, that was Stephanie Dabney was the Firebird. She incredible. Again, I got very lucky being in New York at that time and was doing Martha Graham and Mr. Balanchine's stuff. And Milton Rosenstock was the music director for Dance Theater of Harlem, who was a very venerable, famous Broadway conductor and had done the original Ballet Caravan, which became New York City Ballet. And they had a problem. I think it was the second night. They were opening a 6-week season, their biggest ever, at City Center. And there was some problem. They lost their second conductor. And there was no way Milton was going to get through 6 weeks of the whole thing. So Arthur Mitchell called Mr. Balanchine and said, I got a serious problem. I need another conductor. Do you know anybody? And Mr. Balanchine said, well, I have this kid. Me. And yeah, I met Arthur and Milton for lunch the next day, and they told me the repertory for the season, which was everything from Serenade, Four T's, Firebird, Fall River Legend. I mean, all this stuff, and talk about cramming repertory. But I mean, I had worked with John Torres a little bit. I mean, more observing than later years. We worked together a lot in different places as he staged more and more of the balancing things. But walking into the studio to cram that, Jeffrey Holder did the costumes for that.
Yeah, sure.
And for people who don't know who Jeffrey Holder is, if you remember the old Uncola commercials, you know, yeah. And he was in the James Bond film Live and Let Die, where he was.
And he directed The Wiz on Broadway.
That's right. And that happened not long after that.
Said was one of the greatest musicals ever.
Yes. So, he was one of the most talented people I have ever met in my life. He was a dancer. He was a choreographer. He was a musician. He was the most amazing designer, costume designer, and he did the costumes for Firebird. He could sit down with a napkin and a felt pen and pull off this gown that was stunning. And that was the creative team behind that Firebird. I remember the monsters had these like noodle noses that came down that just were creepy as anything. But I was like a kid in a candy shop, just working with these people and the dancers. That generation in particular, obviously I don't know the newer generation, although I did just do their dancers 2 years ago when they were asked to guest at Houston Ballet while I was there. So I got to do, I think it was called Orange, which was a Stanton Welch ballet with them. And again, that same dedication that they've got as a team, boy, fierce team, helping everybody all the time. And the Firebird, the monster scene, I will never forget it, because the guys just like launched out with these amazing costumes. So I'm glad you went to that. That is,
Many,
I,
many times.
I
That
hate
one I
to
never
see
got
that
tired of.
disappear. No,
Um,
no.
So what's it like when someone either founds a ballet company with his or her name, or in the case of George Balanchine, the New York City Ballet with Lincoln Kirsten, and a Balanchine or a Agnes de Mille or Martha Graham or an Arthur Mitchell or a Alvin Ailey or Robert Joffrey, all these people leave the stage eventually, and the companies bear their name, their imprint, their DNA. Does a company try to recreate the art of the founder? Do they go in new directions and incorporate the art of the founder? I know New York City Ballet then had Peter Martins and other people, and they would add new works, Jerome Robbins works, but they reverentially refer to Mr. B, Mr. Balanchine. He's one of only two people I know in our business who everyone calls Mr. The other was Mr. Bing for Rudolph Bing.
Yeah.
When I worked at the Met, I knew Anthony Bliss, Tony Bliss. I knew Bruce Crawford, Joe Volpe. I knew these people, and they were Tony and Joe and Bruce and so on, but it was Mr. Bing. Always Mr. Bing. And I knew Mr. Bing, but it was Mr. Bing, and it was Mr. Balanchine. So when these figures, I mean, Leonard Bernstein, I knew as Lenny, and most of us did.
I always called him Mr. Bernstein.
Oh, really? Oh, no, I was.
Yeah, I didn't know. No, couldn't do it.
Well, you and I will talk about this another time, but I met him when I was 6, and we knew each other for the rest of his life. So
okay, that's different.
I went with him from the time that I was a little boy and he was a vibrant young maestro to his death. And I spoke to him a few days before he died, not a few days, 2 months. And so, you know, he was Lenny, but he was Lenny to a lot of people here, whether they worked with him or not. But I can see where you would call him Mr. Bernstein. But the question is, what happens to a company that has such a strong imprint? It's not like the Metropolitan Opera or Teatro La Scala that continues a tradition, but it's not that Anthony Bliss created operas, but it is that Mr. Balanchine created ballets.
Yeah, that's a complicated question, and I've watched now companies dealing with the loss of their founding father who or mother. So take, for example, the Martha Graham Company, which has actually gone through exactly that issue. I mean, there were some other things that caused the bumps at the beginning after losing Martha, but Martha and she and I were very close. I spent 12 years with her. I helped. She always did a world premiere every single year in New York, and that was part of my job, was actually helping her find the new score and supporting that. But also I was on the revivals of the ones we were going to lose, like Frontier and Primitive Mysteries, and working with the ballet dancers who used to dance it in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. She was not interested in the past. I mean, she would say that again and again. I'm always looking forward. So she always left the restorations to dancers who were around. And in fact, there was a famous situation with Frontier, where we did the New York revival of Frontier, and that was her first big breakout solo creation, 1937, when she really began her career as a solo choreographer, even though she always thought of herself as only a dancer. And it had to do with whether the jumps to one side or the other are on the beat, or is the on the beat up or down. So she came in, she checked it out. I think Yuriko and Linda Hodes actually were the ones that put it all together. And all the major jumps were down. So what was uncovered, I got a call at like 3 in the morning and saying, can you come into the studio Saturday? And I was like, okay, something's up. I went into the Saturday studio, which is usually mobbed with kids in the school, and it was empty. Went into the room, and there was a movie, machine set up, and they can only play it once because it was silver nitrate film. They had found a film of her dancing Frontier in 1937, one camera shot with Louis Horst, who was the composer and her music director, off camera, no sound. Did the whole thing. She turned to me and she said, can we put the music back so that it sounds like it did in the day? And I said, if you work with me with it, and I played the piano until we got it right, all of a sudden, all the accents were up. And it caused us, why didn't you tell us the accents were up? I mean, Frontier is the woman breaking out. So up made total sense, but she just didn't pass on that piece of historical knowledge. Well, right now, you lose her creative force. You still have her name. What do? Do you only do the ballets that she created, even though there were 138 of them? And the company has decided to be respectful of her wanting to create new ground, and has sought out dancers who would try and, or choreographers who would try and keep her sensibilities of creation at the center and do their own style. And I think that's beginning to work for that company. Other companies don't survive. You need to do new things, and you need to make, finding that formula. You look at Mr. Joffrey's formula, which was one of the smartest ones ever with the company. We had 3 buckets always. One was historical recreations, and they were usually forgotten ballet russe ballets. And Freddie Franklin used to come in and help put steps together because he never forgot anything, and he was a ballet russe dancer. New creations, and he gave people like Twyla Tharp was one of them, first ballets to create, and then full-length ballets that we wouldn't see in the United States. So we had a huge Ashton repertory that nobody else did in the United States. So we, there's the new, recreating the old so it doesn't get lost, and then full lengths that we wouldn't necessarily see in the United States. And that formula, I think is one that the company has continued to try and, running a ballet company is incredibly difficult. I mean, it's got so many moving parts between dancers, production, orchestra. And as you correctly pointed out, coming out of that 1980s, 90s pandemic or epidemic of AIDS made it incredibly difficult for companies to survive. But the name, that maybe that's why Dance Theater of Harlem was called Dance Theater of Harlem instead of Arthur Mitchell's Dance Company. He had the foresight to say, let's make this easy to continue because it's too important.
So much more we could talk about, and I want to get into opera because that's where I live, but I've been loving this conversation about music and dance, and I have one more music and dance question. Among the current, even though he's in his 60s, he's still current to me, choreographers I most admire is Mark Morris, who I find to be very musical. And I went to see his season recently at the what's it called in Chelsea, in the theater. It's a woman's name, the Joyce Theater in
Joyce,
in Chelsea in New York City. And I love his work. I love that he has a very strong classical music sensibility. I love that for the most part, he uses live musicians. Now, this leads to the fact that in my whole experience of working with dance companies, many of them, for finances or for other reasons, would not use live musicians, but would have pieces, including American Ballet Theater, Martha Graham, and others, that were recorded music that we'd play in the theater. And I remember Martha Graham, one of her pieces was called Maple Leaf Rag.
Oh, yeah.
Play that old Maple Leaf Rag for me, would you? It was Martha's beginning to the piece. And but American Ballet Theater, which mostly used live musicians, would occasionally have recorded music. More contemporary dance companies certainly did that. Visiting companies, we would have to at that time adapt to different technologies to try to get the company from the Netherlands, what were they called?
Netherlands Dance Theater.
Netherlands Dance Theater, but there was another one. And the Stuttgart Ballet would come with recorded music, but somehow the interface between American technology and European technology, we'd have issues getting the sound right. Tell me, as a conductor and as a man who has lived in dance music for such a long time, what do you think about recorded music for dance? Is there a place for it? Is it really not good? What do you think?
Again, you go to the complicated issue like right away in this whole thing, and
That's Fred Plotkin.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you for bringing it up, because
Sure.
there are some choreographers, and you probably can figure out who I'm talking to about, who really don't like live music because they can control it. It's like one less thing they have to worry about, one less variable. So then they can choreograph the whole thing, and they know that the music is the platform that's not going to change. Now, depending on the vocabulary of the choreographer, that can work. And there is a place for that. There is not a place for recorded music when you're doing ballet classics, because they are built with the flexibility of an individual dancer within the choreography. And with it are those unpredictable moments where suddenly you stop and somebody does an amazing set of fouette turns or pirouettes at the end of a something, and then the excitement of the music and coming out of it, bam, together. You can't take that away. And if they're trying to fit to a tape, it's like putting handcuffs on them. Mm-hmm. Now, because of budgets, and Martha Graham in the 80s, we used to have to do this too. They would tour nationally and internationally, and they didn't always have an orchestra, which meant that they were bringing what they were doing to places that would normally never see her art. And, some of those recordings I made, mm-hmm. They could do a credible job of the ballet, knowing that that tape was there. But the dancers inherently loved the live art, as Martha did, and they didn't necessarily like it. So then I would come in when I would meet the company in London or meet the company in New York or, Los Angeles or whatever. And I would understand that here's the problem. If the tape is always the same and you're rehearsing and dancing to it, after a while, you're not listening to the music. You're going on muscle body timing. Mm-hmm. So if anything's slightly different now, the balance, I hear clarinets. I never heard clarinets on the tape. It can throw them. So one of the things I learned early on is if I'm coming back into a live situation with a company that's performing this with the same tape on tour for multiple times, I have to first learn their timing to the tape. Mm-hmm. And then I look at them and I treat it like a live performance, knowing that this is what's in their head or their bodies. And then gradually, once they relax and they know that you're there for them, then you can start to work together as a team and move it into the live art form. Mm-hmm. Yes, there is a place for tape. I hate it, Bo. It's a live art form. It needs freedom to be able to share music equally with movement.
So, as you were talking, I'm in New York. We suddenly got a Wagnerian storm passing over here with my room has gotten very dark and there's thunder and lightning outside. Let's talk about the ring cycle.
That's a great segue.
Because I first came to know of you, frankly, not through your dance work, although I've discovered that I've heard you perform probably hundreds of times, but frankly, I was not focused on the conductor in those performances in dance. I was focused on the people on the stage, as you understand. Now I've learned to understand much more about focusing on the conductor. However, I know that you have been doing stuff with Wagner and the Ring. Please talk about that.
Well, that has been a long-standing project of mine that I never actually thought I would ever do. But going back to those early years we were talking about in London, as a as someone, I still considered myself a musical neophyte at that point. Everything was new. Everything was, I just soaked up as much as I possibly could. And the Royal Opera House did the Ring. And I went to the Ring and I didn't have to pay for the ticket.
And was this Haitink conducting? Who was conducting?
I think it was Haitink, yeah.
Bernard Haitink, yeah.
Yeah. And incidentally, he later on did the ballet for a couple of things that I was at rehearsal studios. And I was impressed that as a famous opera symphony conductor, he would do the ballet.
Yep.
I told him so. It was really something. Anyway, I went through the Ring. First of all, I was surprised at how many of the tunes I knew, because I didn't think I knew that many from the Ring. And it was long.
They're good.
It was long. That was the thing that I came out with just like, wow, that was long. So for the last, 40 years, actually it was more like 30 years, I kept thinking, as I would see a production of the Ring, there's so much good music in there, and it's just long. And not only is it long, but there's very few opportunities for anybody, unless you happen to have a lot of money and you live in New York or London or one of the big cities, Paris, to ever see it. And then you think of all those Wagnerian singers who train to be Wagnerian singers who will never get to the Met to sing it. So you've wasted all of this effort. And so going back to my 1984 Stravinsky experience, I was thinking, intuitively, there must be a way to make this work so that you keep all of the best bits and you keep the story intact. And that's important, because if you remember, I'm telling you what you already know, the Wagner operas, particularly when Tannhäuser came out and was such a radical change of direction for opera, the critics hated it. They could recognize the fact that, okay, orchestrationally, he did really interesting things, but they hated it because it wasn't opera. The public immediately went, wow. And they, I think, were reacting to the dramatic qualities of the whole thing. So I've never liked going to a performance where they do a concert performance and they'll do this little bit and then this little bit and then this little bit, and the key relationships are jarring as you go from thing to thing. There's no through line. And what are you missing? You're missing the dramatic impact, because that can only come in the opera. So over the years, I've gone through, first I went through the story, and then I tried to edit the story. How short can I get the story without losing the story? And then I looked at the story as it lines up in the scores and said, okay, can't get from here to here because there's a bad transition, key relationship, and no singer's going to be able in 2 bars to go to the next key. So then maybe you need to take it here, maybe you need to take it here, maybe you need to do something else. But anyway, it's like a huge puzzle. And in 2016-17, I finally got to do the whole, what I call the essential ring. And it fits in 2 evenings, 3 hours each, 2 operas per evening. And I was lucky enough to get some fantastic Wagnerian singers, many of whom had sung at the Met. And yeah, it works. So I felt really good about that.
You know Eve Queller. I don't know if everyone listening does. Eve Queller is now in her 90s, hale and hearty and beautiful as ever. I saw her recently.
Oh, great.
And let's not say she was the first woman conductor, but in many ways, she was the first woman conductor. And she ran something for many years called Opera Orchestra of New York, where she would persuade the likes of Montserrat Caballé and the young Renee Fleming and all kinds of people to do works that they would only do that once with Eve Queller, because they would not necessarily get to do them again. Samuel Ramey would do Robert Le Diable, things like that. But they all turned out for Eve, as everyone called her. Leonie Rieseneck, a phenomenal performance as the stepmother in Yenofah, before the Met had it with her. Just phenomenal, one great performance after another. Verdi's Aroldo with Caballé. And one evening with Eva Martone, she did the 4 conclusions to the 4 ring operas. So you had the Going Up the Rainbow Bridge, where Ava did not sing. Then you had basically a baritone or a bass baritone singing The Magic Fire, with Ava Martone standing there emoting as Brunhilde, but not singing. But then you also had her sing with a tenor as Brunhilde and Siegfried, and then closing the night with the immolation scene from Götterdämmerung. And to me, that was a very creative program that brought the big highlights, but they were all the conclusions, because Wagner knew how to end an act.
Yeah.
You know, if you were napping for 10 minutes before the end of the act, suddenly everything would combine. I'm joking here because I really love every note, but his endings of his acts, especially the endings of his operas, are extraordinary, and none more than Götterdämmerung, in my view. And so Martone did that. I also, a number of years ago, and I would say this would be the 90s, was invited to Reykjavik in Iceland, where there was a young company called the Icelandic National Opera that now has a theater and has become more established. And its head was a tenor named Garder Cortez. And I believe that his son is now the head of the company. And they were doing an approved reduction of the Ring by none other than Wolfgang Wagner, the grandson of Richard Wagner. And I was there for the casting and a lot of the staging and the first performance. And it was an 8-hour in one day event that reduced the Ring. And apparently it could only be done in Reykjavik with the approval of Wolfgang Wagner. And they didn't much do it elsewhere. It may have been done in a couple of other places since then. I've not kept track. But the premiere was in Reykjavik. And as I think I told you on the phone, the greatest thing was casting Call for Valkyries in Iceland. Was just we had hundreds.
I do remember that. Yeah,
hundreds of them. We could have done nothing with the Ride of the Valkyries 10 times, but it was very provocative. But I, as a completist, missed all those other things. In my somewhat professional view, I would say that the Ring cycle is kind of perfect, except for 10 minutes in the second act of Die Walküre, which is a bit much. I've discussed this with the wonderful Stephanie Blythe, and she put me right on why those 10 minutes are necessary. Part of them are Fricka's scene, but not really. It's more after Fricka leaves the stage. But in her view, every note is essential, and I certainly accept what Stephanie Blythe says. But how do you decide what goes? I didn't have the chance to ask Wolfgang Wagner. He was kind of formidable, and he was not taking questions from anyone. He created this, he imposed it, you do what he wanted, and that was it. But I can ask you, how do you decide what stays and what goes to make it dramatically viable? Because to me, a lot of the power in the Ring is the repetition and the way Wagner revisits music in different ways. So when the Norns, who are these three old lamenting ladies at the beginning of Götterdämmerung, in effect tell the story of Rheingold, Walküre, and Siegfried, so that, as Anna Russell said, you don't have to go to those first three operas. You could just come in with the Norns. But nonetheless, a lot of people find the Norns extraneous, but it's the key that Wagner puts that in as something, everything is withered, is the way I hear it.
Mhm.
And that, everything is bad. And then Waltraute shows up and says to Brunhilde, come back, just forget everything. And Brunhilde summons the courage and the power, and you hear it in the music, to say, no, I have to be like Martha Graham and push to the future. So how do you know what to cut and what to keep?
Well, isn't Anna Russell's version only 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's actually
She got it down to
22, but
15.
I take your point. I think it's 22 minutes, but I take your point.
Okay. Well, that was actually why it took me so long to figure it out. And I could come at it with kind of fresh eyes, in that I hadn't spent a lot of time in the Wagner world. And so I thought, okay, what's the thing that hits me most about these operas? And it was sort of like going back to the early, what you would read in the 1800s, which was audience got it immediately, this is similar. There's a similarity between Tannhäuser and Swan Lake Tchaikovsky. The same thing happened in the ballet world that happened with Wagner here. So I thought, okay, let's start with the story, because of course the Wagner wrote the story too. I mean, the story and the music both. It was interesting to me that Götterdämmerung, which is what he started with in the libretto, he wrote it backwards, that was almost impossible to cut. So the whole last 25 minutes of Götterdämmerung is complete in this version. There is no cut possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not musically, not story-wise. You just can't do it. So by starting with the story first, just putting the music out of my mind, just looking at the story and going, do I need this bit? Do I need this repetition? No. Do I need, okay, well, maybe this character is a nice little piece, but maybe it's also got a reason for being that's not story, but somebody needs a vocal break. So we got this person singing for this. And, sort of working my way through that. To me, the musical storytelling, and this is where I kind of equate it to what happened on Broadway. And I'm sorry, this links three ways: Broadway, Tchaikovsky, Swan Lake, and the Wagner opera. Broadway and opera, up to this point, was sort of like, oh, here's a song coming, and then somebody would sing a song and something else would happen. And Wagner, part of the reason that the critics hated the whole thing was the fact that he didn't do that. It was musical through line storytelling constantly, which is why, we always have this problem about saying an aria from a Wagner opera, because there isn't an aria, it's just through. So that's why, again, I thought drive story first, then look at how that piece that I need musically is written so that I have a seamless transition that goes in to make sure that it's a Wagner transition, but that it gives enough time for a singer to get oriented to the modulation or key change so that they can come in with their entrance, and it keeps the story complete.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm not going to argue the point that every note is absolutely essential and perfect, because I think the more you know these operas, the more you get wedded to that. And my hope is this gives greater access to regional orchestras, smaller opera houses, gives opportunity for singers who have that kind of special Wagner power and voice to sing and that audiences, you know, if you live out in the boonies someplace and you're lucky enough to have a regional orchestra who can do this and they hear this version, maybe they'll take a trip to New York City and see it at the Met and get the whole thing. And
Mhm.
it was important to look at the musical storyline and make the decisions based on keeping that musical storyline. And there were some tough problems. I mean, there were a couple of spots where it was a little sticky to figure it out, like the ending of Götterdämmerung. And you want to watch the Union clock. You got to
Yeah.
think within 3 hours. And I wanted to give 5 minutes of safety anyway, or 6 minutes. So in case somebody gets a little bit lengthy, you don't end up with overtime. But it wasn't easy.
I want to work through this a bit. Maybe you know about me, maybe not, that I have taught ring seminars and symposia all over the world and really live in this music and love it, love it, love it, even though I'm more identified with Verdi, but still it's pretty fantastic. And, but even I, having attended 48 complete cycles and many more individual performances of different ones and worked on numerous productions, I have my very strong feelings about these operas. And I always hear in my head the words of conductors I worked with and stage directors I worked with who taught me a lot about this stuff. And I'm going to put this in the most generic terms. Rheingold is where Das Rheingold is where the story gets told, and we learn who all the main characters are, except maybe Brunhilde. Die Walküre is where we meet Brunhilde and her relationship with her father, Wotan, and where things take a very bad turn. That the warnings that we got in Rheingold about if you do this, if you take the ring out of the Rhine, the gold out of the Rhine and fashion a ring and so on, it will lead to problems. And therefore, a lot of the details about where the story might go happen in Walküre. Act 1 of Walküre is a wonderful 65-minute thing unto itself that is often done in concert at orchestras with just 3 singers. But Act 2 is where James Levine said to me, it was the hardest act for him to conduct in the entire ring cycle because of the brutality of the story and the horrors of what was happening. And he found it emotionally hard sometimes to get through that act. And then the incredible, never mind the Ride of the Valkyries, which we love, but the period afterward, the Wotan says goodbye to Brunhilde's favorite daughter in some of the most gorgeous music ever written. And I was present when the scene was created at the Met with Hildegard Behrens and James Morris, directed by by Otto Schenk and staged by Gunther Schneider-Simpson with the Magic Fire. When you're involved in that production, it's hard not to recreate that in your mind all the time, especially because there's a great video directed by Brian Large that captures what happened. So then Siegfried, Levine always said to me, is the most fun to conduct. And Götterdämmerung, to me, is the most exciting, and the Norns are fine. That's the most generic term, but as you correctly said, Götterdämmerung, he wrote the libretto first and worked backwards. So the best libretto probably is Rheingold, and the best music, and I'm speaking very generally, is Götterdämmerung. The music is great throughout. But I would guess that Siegfried is the opera, the one that Levine loved and found joy in, where you could cut the most and probably did. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct.
What remained in Siegfried?
Gee, I have what remained.
Is the forest bird there?
Yes, forest bird's there. Yes.
Okay. Is the bear there?
And Sarai Cole actually sang that, I think.
Did the bear survive or no?
Siegfried. The bear did not survive.
Okay.
The bear did not survive.
Did all that smithing that happens with Siegfried and Mime in the first act, the hammer, 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 yes. Hammer, hammer. Okay, that's all there.
Yeah.
Act 2 with the slaying of the dragon of Fafnir. That's there?
That's there.
Okay, so what got cut?
What got cut? Well, I'll have to send you a copy of the The
Okay.
piano vocal score
But
when I did it.
Wotan in that opera is called The Wanderer. Did
Yes,
all of his
he's there.
questions, those
He's there.
survive? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. 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 And Alfred Walker sang that, and he was
Wonderful. Yeah.
fabulous. He
Yeah.
just was great. So I mean, I was having a thought while you were going through that, as you said, very generic term of,
Very generic.
and there's a parallel, and you know how your mind works in funny ways over various years. So why did he start at the end with a story and work forward? And then Siegfried, which is a pivotal spot where you do get humor for the first time. But I think by introducing the characters at the beginning, it's important because then you care about them. By the time you get to Siegfried, you know them intimately and you care about them. So that leads you into what happens in Götterdämmerung, which is the big emotional explosion. Now there's a parallel, and I would call it a germ in my thinking, that came from Martha Graham.
Mm-hmm.
Because working on her Rite of Spring, I got a lot of stories about when she did it with Massine's choreography in the Ballet Russe.
Mm.
And of course, Stravinsky wrote the scenario for Rite of Spring. He did not have a choreographer. It was all his idea and the flow. And he had a great deal of respect for her, which is probably why she didn't do this while he was alive. But what she said to me was, I think he had it wrong.
Wow.
Because he introduces the chosen one so late in the ballet that nobody cares about her. So she brought the chosen one in at the beginning of Rite of Spring so that you get to know her, so that by the time she's sacrificed, you care. And it was funny, while she was telling me, I was thinking Ring and going, that makes a lot of sense. So you sort of took me back there as you were going through your timeline thing, that it's part of the storytelling is making sure that you, and as the person who are taking in the story, care about what happens to the people. And Götterdämmerung is devastating, I think, when the power of the music, and yeah.
It's a thing unto itself, Götterdämmerung.
Yeah.
And I think most people I know love Valkyria the most because of the hit tunes, and also because, frankly, of the extraordinary first act and the extraordinary second half of the third act after the Ride of the Valkyrie, which we think of as the big hit. But I forget that very quickly when Wotan and Brunhilde have their confrontation. Now, when I teach opera to people who don't know opera, but they don't want to go with me to Bohème or Mozart or Rigoletto, I take them to Das Rheingold. And somehow I say to them, it's the same length as one of your favorite Marvel comic movies, and a lot better. And they get into it as a story.
Uh-huh.
And to me, the whole descent into the Nibelheim is thrilling music, and everything being told about oppression and so on. You understood Wagner as a man of the mid-19th century watching Das Rheingold, and the Rainbow Bridge and all of that. It's an amazing, to me, after Götterdämmerung, it's the other perfect opera in the Ring. And Valkyria and Siegfried are fantastic, but need workarounds, in my view, for some people. Not for me, but for some people, they have trouble getting through them. All that smithing in the first act of Siegfried can really go on. And then what is that bird singing about it? It's like, what is that? Yeah. Why is Nature Boy listening to a bird in the forest? And it seems kind of ridiculous, but we understand why.
Yeah. You just made me think of something else. Going back to Tchaikovsky and Swan Lake.
That's where I was going to go, actually. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I was thinking of the article, which fairly recently was rediscovered, that Tchaikovsky wrote when he was in New York City doing the dedication of Carnegie Hall. And a writer asked him what he thought of Wagner. And you filtering it through Tchaikovsky's own experiences. He said he has great respect for the musical talent of the man, but not Wagnerism, which he didn't then really explain much beyond that. But what he said was, he was a great talent who sort of missed the boat. And that he said, if Wagner had not written opera, because he didn't understand it, which I thought was interesting, he would have been one of the great symphony composers, because, as Tchaikovsky said, the best bits in the Wagner operas are the symphonic bits, and that's what we play. Now, when I read that and I thought about what happened with Swan Lake, you're looking through Tchaikovsky's eyes. First of all, Tchaikovsky wrote lots of operas. One of his greatest masterpieces in the ballet world was a double bill, which was Nutcracker and Iolanthe.
Yeah.
And he was convinced Iolanthe was going to be the thing that was going to be, and it wasn't. It was Nutcracker. And he was stuck in what the critics would have respected in Wagner's day of here comes the tune, here comes the aria, and couldn't look at what Wagner was doing. And the reason that Swan Lake in 1877, when it premiered, that was a miserable flop. Miserable. Reisinger did the choreography because Petipa got sick. And probably didn't want to take on the most famous composer in the world, conductor, pianist, whatever, and didn't know what to do with the music. And Swan Lake, Tchaikovsky wrote the scenario, which was unusual for the day, never happened. So everybody left him alone because he was so famous, nobody wanted to talk to him. He wrote the story. Act 4 completely stymied everybody because it's symphonic. And up to that point, when you went to the ballet, you'd have ba do ba do ba, there were all these little individual dances that were strung together, and now we had this symphonic through line, and it was sort of the same problem. I mean, he's looking at the Wagner operas and going, "Well, great symphonic stuff. Didn't understand opera. If he'd been a symphony conductor, it would have been great." And yet Tchaikovsky already realized that he failed with Swan Lake, although the public loved it. Critically, it was creamed because the choreographer didn't know what to do with it. And it was, 17 years later that Petipa picked it up with Ivanov, because they'd gone through Sleeping Beauty, where Tchaikovsky followed the rules for ballet of the day and said, Petipa, give me your menu, 68 bars in 2, 112 bars in 3. And I will write great music to the menu. And in that instance, he brought Petipa on to be able to have the ability to work with more difficult music. And then he was able to do Swan Lake. But I thought it was interesting how the two changed history in their art forms of music and movement and music and opera. And there's some similarity there.
And speaking of boats, something that Tchaikovsky and Wagner have in common is my beloved Italian region of Liguria, because Tchaikovsky spent a lot of time in Sanremo, because Sanremo was sort of the Palm Beach for the Russian aristocracy.
Oh.
The Russian Orthodox cathedral there is in Nice and a couple of other places, but they would spend time in Sanremo and Liguria. And it's fascinating in this place with palm trees and pesto that you suddenly find a Russian Orthodox cathedral right at the middle of town near the railway station. And the nearby hotels is where all the Russian aristocracy would stay. Down the road a bit, Genoa, Wagner, who once said that after seeing Genoa, London and Paris were boring, and I get that, set sail from Genoa to travel south in Italy. And there were terrible rough seas in the boat that he was in, and it pitched up in La Spezia. And he was very seasick and nauseated and head spinning and dizzy. And they carried him to a boarding house in La Spezia, and he lay there for days, and his head was spinning around. And they were very worried about him, that he was very sick. And then at a certain point, he bolted up in his bed there and went to a desk and took out pen and paper and wrote out the E flat chord that begins Das Rheingold. And it came to him in La Spezia as a result of bad weather in Liguria. And the two men were often there at the same time, but not in the same place. But people don't know that Tchaikovsky also went to Tuscany and wrote Souvenir de Florence, and Wagner spent a lot of time in Sicily and the Amalfi Coast, and Venice, of course, for Tristan and other things. But there's something very particular about the atmosphere of Liguria that inspired also Sibelius and Edward Elgar and many people right in that little patch of land, was hugely inspirational to many, many composers from the north, so to speak.
Okay, I know where my next trip is going to be because I haven't been there.
You'll talk to, it's fantastic. You'll talk to me. I love that part of Italy. Jonathan McPhee, you and I could continue at Wagnerian length. We nearly have, but it's been a great pleasure. I always love having conductors on my program because I learn so much.
Well,
And
you have a huge knowledge base, which I feel like every time I talk to you, I'm coming away with more than I brought to the table.
well, thank you. But I mean, especially today, because yes, I was around dance forever and worked the shows and so on, and worked with many of the protagonists, but I didn't really understand all or realize all the stuff that you explained today so well, so clearly. And also naming all of these figures, not by dropping those names, but explaining why they were important figures in music, in dance. And it's important that we remember not only the Martha Grahams, but the Manuel Rosenthals, and the people who really were the connective thread to the generations before us. And, I knew people who studied with Puccini directly, and
Really?
therefore could learn about Puccini from people who learned directly from Puccini and what he wanted in particular scenes, or the way he created a character, or the way a singer would say, no, maestro, I don't want it that way. That's not good for me. I want something else. And how Puccini, who was a very resourceful, brilliant composer, could adapt to that while always maintaining his aesthetic, but nonetheless creating something that would work for the artist, the performer as well. So I hope we could do this again. I hope we'll, we're still in the pandemic, in my view, in a different phase, but when we really can be out in the world more, collaborate on something, I would enjoy that.
Well, I would be honored, really. And it's really interesting to find out we were probably in the same theater at the same time.
Yeah.
And know each other. It's very funny.
Because you were in the pit and I was cooking in the
Yeah, I don't feel bad about not noticing
and making pasta for 50 people.
And I always say that I'm the guy in the hole there in a ballet, and you shouldn't be aware of me. You should be aware of what's going up there and what you're hearing. So,
well, actually, since we're talking about that, the last thing about Metropolitan Opera House geography, the entrance to the orchestra pit is on A level, and right below that, and B level, is the company cafeteria.
Oh, yeah.
And often, I would remember, not during the day when we had rehearsals, but at night when company members, say chorus members dressed for Nabucco, would come down in costume to get a coffee, that you could hear what was happening in the pit right above us. And that was thrilling. Because somehow I don't know why, now that I think about it, the sound was different during performances than during the day, but it was extraordinary. During the day, you could sit and have conversations, but at night you had the power of the pit right above you, sort of shaking the glassware and, loosening the lasagna from its gelatinous state. But anyway, to be continued.
Okay.
Jonathan McPhee, thank you very much. And I commend people listening all around the world to your work, both in dance, but also in ballet arrangements, and especially your opera arrangements and things that you'll do in the future.
Oh, thank you so much, Fred.
Well, the storm just ended here.